Well, hello, folks. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. This week we've got chapters 17, 18, 19, and 20. The IRS starts to track David down. Will they catch him? Hope you enjoy.
Chapter 17. As David drove away, Charles memorized the license plate number on the truck. He got out of the car and picked up his wallet, dusted it off, and put it back in his pocket. He started the long walk back to the highway, wondering how he was going to explain this to his superiors. It took him over an hour to walk back to the highway, still longer to flag down a car and convince the driver to let him use his cell phone. When he got to town, he went to the police station and, using their computers and the license plate number of the truck, he ascertained that the truck had been rented from a local business. He then commandeered a police cruiser and drove to the rental company. He checked their records and found that the truck had been rented to a Randy Dotson. This name matched the name he had gotten from the gold buyer. The rental company said all of their vehicles were equipped with GPS tracking devices. It took the system a few minutes to find the truck. The map showed it to be in an old part of downtown in a warehouse. Charles radioed the police and asked to have several officers meet him at that address. When they got to the address, all the doors were locked, and the police officers were hesitant about breaking down the door without a search warrant. Charles reminded them that he was with the IRS and that he didn't need a search warrant. They broke down one of the side doors and went inside. What they discovered was a chop shop, where stolen vehicles were taken apart and their parts were sold individually. Charles knew this was a dead end. He let the local police sort out the chop shop and went back to the police station. He still had a name and address. He booked a seat on the next flight to Seattle. Charles was met at the airport by some fellow IRS agents. They went to Randy Dotson's home. When Randy answered the door and identified himself, Charles instantly knew that he had been scammed by the man in the desert. They started interrogating Randy, but for some reason, which Charles couldn't understand, Randy did not want to cooperate with them. But after threatening him with a lot of trumped-up charges, Randy finally gave them David's name and address. Chapter 18. When David got home, he packed up what possessions he had left. The next morning he rented a large moving truck. David drove the truck a few blocks from the rental company, then stopped and slid under the dash and disconnected the GPS tracking device. The truck had a long ramp that slid out of the back. This made loading the boxes of gold bars and the 3 large stones a lot easier. Within 2 hours, David had the truck loaded. David stopped at his landlord's house on the way out of town. "Here are the keys to the house and the keys and title to my truck. I want you to have it. There's a little furniture left in the house. You can have that as well." "Why are you giving me your truck? I would be glad to keep an eye on it until you can come back for it." "I don't think I'll need it where I'm going." "And where is that?" "It's better if you don't know." "Well, then let me buy it from you." "You might not get to keep it, and if you do, think of it as payment for all the hell that's fixing to break loose around here." "What have you done?" Earl asked. "I just tried to protect and keep what was mine." "That doesn't tell me too much." "The less you know, the better." David thanked Earl again and then drove away. This spiked Earl's curiosity. So when David drove away, Earl drove down to the house and cautiously went inside. It was just as David had said. There were some old pieces of furniture left, and the house was fairly clean. When he checked the closet in the master bedroom, he noticed the partition David had made. Earl looked behind the partition, but the space was empty. What could David have been hiding there? He asked himself. His first thought was drugs, but he had known David for years. He simply would not believe that without proof. Earl went into the garage. The floor seemed dustier than usual. Earl opened the garage door to let in more light. When he turned back and looked into the garage, the sunlight twinkled off the specks of gold in the dust. He picked up some of the dust and walked out into the sunlight. His hand lit up when the sunlight hit the gold. Earl walked into the backyard. It too sparkled in places. He bent down and raked at the dirt a bit. There was a layer of crushed quartz about 6 inches thick covering the entire backyard. "Well, I'll be," Earl said out loud. It all made sense now. He remembered that David was a weekend prospector. David had hit it big and was trying to get away with his gold. Then a startling thought crossed the old man's mind. He knew David had sold off much of his furniture and belongings at the garage sale, and he had left the furniture he hadn't sold in the house. So why had he needed such a large moving truck? "You must have hit the mother lode. Good for you, son," Earl murmured to himself. Chapter 19. As David had predicted, 2 days later Earl got a knock on his door. When he answered the door, 2 men in black suits identified themselves as IRS agents. They asked if they could come in and talk to him about David. "I have nothing to say to you," Earl replied. "Look, Mr. Manny, you can either answer our questions, or we can say that you are an accomplice in this crime. At the very least, we can review your tax records for the last 7 years. I'm sure we can find a mistake or two in them," one of the agents said threateningly. Earl stepped aside to allow the agents in. They walked into the house and immediately started searching every room. "What the hell are you doing? You said you just wanted to ask me some questions." "Is that not David Johnson's truck in your side yard?" "Yes, but he is not here." "When do you think he'll return?" "I don't think he will. He gave me that truck before he left. Look, here's the title." "We need the keys to the truck, also the keys to the house you rented Mr. Johnson." Earl knew this was a losing battle. He gave the keys to the agents, who immediately started searching David's truck. When they found nothing of any value to them, they started interrogating Earl. Since David had told Earl nothing of his plans, Earl could answer all the questions truthfully. The 2 agents left Earl's house and moved on to David's. Earl called the sheriff's department and told the sheriff what was happening. Earl and the sheriff had been good friends since high school. "I don't know what I can do, but I'll be right out," the sheriff told Earl. Earl and the sheriff arrived at David's house at the same time. The 2 agents were already inside searching. One of the agents came out and greeted the sheriff. "I hope you're not going to get in our way, Sheriff," the agent said in a condescending tone. "No, you boys can do your search, but if you start to harm Mr. Manning's house in any way, I will arrest you and put you in my jail. Then I'll call all the local and state news reporters and fill them in on this travesty of justice." You could tell that the sheriff had hit a bone with that remark, because the agent seemed to back off a little. Earl and the sheriff watched as the agents continued their search. Eventually they stumbled upon the dust in the garage and in the backyard. They took samples of these and left. The sheriff turned to Earl. "They might come back, but I don't think they'll hurt your house. What did that boy do to get them all stirred up?" "I think he got away with not paying them a lot of money," Earl replied. "Good for him," the sheriff exclaimed. Chapter 20. David stayed on interstate highways until he got to Texas. Then he cut off onto some back roads. Whenever he stopped for anything, he paid in cash and was always mindful of the speed limit. The last thing he wanted was for some state policeman to go snooping around in the back of the moving truck. He stopped at rest areas along the way and took short naps, always keeping his pistol close to his side. David worked his way down to the coast and stopped in Galveston. He checked into a local motel. He parked the truck close to the front office and checked the rear door to make sure it was locked securely. David then went in and got a good night's sleep. The next morning he stopped at the front desk, bought all the local newspapers, and went into the motel's restaurant and ordered breakfast. David was scanning the want ads. He needed to buy a boat that would get him to the Cayman Islands. Halfway through the second paper, David found a candidate. The boat was a 2005 Sebring Sundancer 500. The price was $290,000. David didn't know a whole lot about big boats, so he opened his laptop and logged into the hotel's Wi-Fi. David looked up the specifications for the boat. He found that it was 54 feet long, and the fuel tank held 560 gallons. David didn't know for sure, but he thought that should be enough fuel capacity. He got directions to the address in the want ad and called the number. David told the man who answered that he was interested in his boat and wanted to see it. The man said he would be home all day and to come by at any time. David finished his breakfast and set out. David pulled up to the house at the address the ad had indicated. He couldn't help but notice the for sale sign in the front yard. The sign was for the house, not the boat. David looked down the street and was amazed at the number of for sale signs on the other houses. This was an expensive neighborhood where all the backyards ended in the Galveston Bay. Some homes had private docks, but for those that didn't, there was a dock just for people that lived in this subdivision. David walked up and rang the doorbell. A young man opened the door. David introduced himself and said he had called about the boat. The young man shook David's hand and introduced himself as Martin Simmons. Martin looked at the moving truck David was driving, and a suspicious look crossed his face. David quickly picked up on this and said, "I'm in the process of moving to town." This seemed to put Martin at ease for the moment. "The boat's at the neighborhood dock. Let me get the keys." As David and Martin walked to the dock, David commented, "I noticed the for sale sign in front of your house." "Yeah, like a fool. I took out a second mortgage when the real estate prices were so high a few years back. Now the office where I work is downsizing, and I'll have to relocate to Dallas. I will probably take a bath on the house if it ever does sell." "Does the boat have a lien on it?" David asked. "No, I paid cash out of the second mortgage loan." As he approached the dock, David was amazed. The boat looked brand new. "Can one person handle this boat?" David asked. "Sure. Do you want to take a spin around the bay?" "I would like that very much." Martin fired up the engines and untied the boat from the dock. When they were clear of the dock, Martin opened the throttle up a little and planed out the boat. As they cruised around, Martin showed David the navigational instruments. "This sure beats a compass and a sextant," David remarked. "Anybody can navigate these days," Martin replied. "How far have you taken this boat?" "We took it to the Bahamas one time." "Did you have plenty of fuel capacity?" "We still had a few gallons when we arrived, but it all has to do with the weather conditions." David had seen enough. This boat was perfect for his needs. They went back to the dock and tied up. Martin showed David all the amenities and extras on the boat. As they walked back to Martin's house, David asked, "Okay, what's your bottom dollar?" "Well, I suppose I would take $250,000 if a guy was serious." "Give me a moment," David said as he walked to the moving truck and retrieved his briefcase. "Can we go inside to negotiate?" "Sure," Martin said, not knowing just what was happening here. Did this guy have that much cash in that briefcase? Martin wondered. They went in and sat down at the kitchen table. David opened the briefcase and removed 2 of the gold bars. He laid them gently on the table. To say that Martin was surprised was an understatement. David judged his reaction and said, "I'm prepared to pay you the $250,000 in cash, if that's what you would prefer, but these 2 bars will appraise at more than that." "How do I know they're real?" Martin asked cautiously. Is there a pawnbroker or jeweler in town that you know and trust?" "Well, yes. As a matter of fact, I have a friend that owns a pawn shop." "I will be glad to take them down and let him appraise them for you." "I just don't know," Martin said as he cautiously reached out and picked up one of the bars. This was what David had been waiting for, and he watched Martin closely. Martin picked up one of the bars and raised it into the air a few times. That was all it took. David saw Martin's eyes change when the gold fever took control of him. "Okay, do you want to ride with me to the pawn shop?" Martin asked. "No, I'll follow you if that's all right." "Okay, it's not very far." David followed Martin to a local pawn shop. They went in and Martin greeted his friend, Don Taylor. "Don, I have something I need you to check out for me. Can we go to your office?" "Sure," Don replied. The three of them went into Don's office. When they were seated, David produced the gold bars. By the look on Don's face, David could tell that he was instantly skeptical. "I need you to assign a value to these," Martin remarked. "I'll be right back," Don said and left the office. He returned momentarily, carrying a set of scales and other test equipment. Don then took one of the bars and weighed it. He then tested it for purity. When he was done, he looked up the spot price for gold that day and started punching buttons on the calculator. When he was finished, David could see a little sweat start to bead on the man's forehead. Don performed the same test on the second bar. By the time he was through, he was sweating profusely and had to stop and swab his forehead with a paper towel from time to time. "With today's prices, I would appraise these to be worth $185,000 each," Don proclaimed to Martin. "Are you sure about that, Don?" Martin asked. "Chemistry doesn't lie." The three men sat in silence for a few minutes. Finally, David asked, "Well, Martin, do we have a deal?" "Give me a few minutes," Martin replied. "How would I go about selling these?" Martin asked Don. "If you really want to sell them, I have some customers that will gladly buy them," Don told Martin. Martin looked at David. "Okay, we have a deal." "Do you have one of those electric engraving tools?" David asked Don. "Why, yes, I think we have a couple." "Can I use one right quick?" Don left and returned in a few minutes with the tool. He plugged it in and handed it to David. David handed the tool to Martin. Martin just had a puzzled look on his face. "Engrave something on the bottom of both bars in your handwriting. That way, when we make our transaction later, you can be sure that you're getting the same bars your friend appraised." "Oh, I see. Good idea. I should have thought of that." Martin wrote something on the bottom of each bar, and David put them back in his briefcase. They both thanked Don for his time. As David turned to leave, he reached into his pocket and got one of the gold coins. He tossed it to Don and said, "I'm sure Martin and I would appreciate this staying between the three of us." "That's not a problem. Come back any time." As David and Martin were leaving the pawn shop, David paused at the gun counter. Don walked up behind the counter. "See anything you like?" "Let me see that AR-15, David said. Don handed David the gun. David looked the gun over, then laid it on the counter. "Do you have a semi-automatic shotgun?" "Sure do," Don answered as he handed David a Mossberg Model 930 tactical shotgun. David inspected the shotgun, then laid it beside the AR-15. "I'll need 6 20-round clips for the AR, plus 2 cases of shells. Better give me a case of shells for the shotgun as well. Make them double-aught buckshot." "Let me have a case of hollow points for this as well," David said as he laid his .44 Magnum onto the counter. "You know there's a 2-week waiting period," Don said. "I was hoping we could negotiate that," David said as he slid 3 gold coins across the counter. "I will still need a name to register them under," Don replied. David handed the Randy Dotson license to Don. "This is a real name, and I'm pretty sure it will pass the background checks. I just don't have the 2 weeks to wait around." Don still didn't seem to be convinced. David slid yet another gold coin across the counter. Don picked up the gold coins. "Let me box these up for you, Mr. Dodson." Martin had brought the title of the boat with them, so the next stop was the Department of Game and Fish to transfer the title. Martin told the young girl at the title desk that David was buying the boat for $25,000, so he would not have to pay as much sales tax. The girl looked skeptical, but she had no way of verifying the real sales price. She typed up the forms and both men signed them. When they walked outside, David handed the briefcase to Martin. "Is it all right if I leave the boat at the dock for a few days?" David asked. "As far as I'm concerned, you can leave it there forever. Nobody will say anything until I sell the house." "Will you be home tomorrow?" "Yes, I don't have any plans at the moment." "Good. I would like for you to take me out again and teach me how to run everything." "I can do that." "You're really not moving to town, are you?" "No," David replied, "but I am going to take a little trip." "Are you a drug runner?" "No, I don't mess with drugs." "Look, it's better that you don't know, but I can assure you that it's something you would do under the same circumstances." The next day, Martin and David took the boat out again. This time they left the bay and headed out into the open ocean. Martin showed David all the equipment, including the GPS and autopilot. As they made their way back to the dock, they stopped and filled the boat with fuel and fresh water. David wanted to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. The next day, David went to a local temp service and hired a couple of day laborers. He had them load the boxes of gold onto the boat. When they were done, David paid them $300 each. The way they both looked at the money, David could tell it was more than they had seen in a while. "I have one more job for you gentlemen, if you're up for it," David told the workers. The two men looked at each other suspiciously. David had done such a good job camouflaging the boxes of gold. The two men were convinced that David was a gun runner and that they had just loaded the boat with a lot of guns and ammo. "What does it involve?" one of the men asked cautiously. "I need you to drive this truck to Dallas and turn it in at one of the rental places." The two men exchanged looks again. "There's $1,000 in it for each of you if you're interested." That did it. The two men agreed to take the truck. "What do we tell them if they ask how we got the truck?" one of the men asked. "Here's what you need to do. Find one of the rental places, then wait until they close and everyone leaves. Then pull the truck onto the parking lot and lock the keys inside the truck." "How do we get back?" Shaking his head, David replied, "That's why there's two of you. One drives the truck, the other drives another vehicle." "We don't have a car good enough to make it that far." "Well, then rent one. Here's a couple of more $100 for a rental car." David watched the two men drive away in the truck. He wondered if they would make it to Dallas. At this point, David really didn't care if the men took the truck all the way to Dallas or not. The only reason he was doing this was to put another thorn in the side of the IRS. Let them hunt around Dallas for a few months, David thought to himself. David was prepared to leave at a moment's notice. The boat was fueled and fully stocked. He started to leave then, but he decided to get some sleep and leave the first thing in the morning. David slept on the boat that night. He found the bed in the master cabin to be quite comfortable. The next morning, David was up early. He checked everything to make sure he was ready to go. The weather outlook was good, so David cranked the engines to let them warm up a bit. Martin stepped from his back door and waved. David waved back as he backed the boat away from the dock. David took it slow until he cleared the bay, then opened the motors up a bit and set a course for Corpus Christi.